Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Joan Woodward, and I'm honored to lead the Travelers Institute, which is the public policy and educational arm of Travelers. So welcome to Wednesdays with Woodward, our last of 2024. This webinar series we started, as you all know, during the pandemic, and we've continued it because of your engagement. So thank you for being here. As always, before we get started, I'd like to share our disclaimer about today's program. So today we're taking on wildfires. What's the latest? Where are they happening? And importantly, what can we as community members and homeowners do about them? We're going to explore all of this with one interesting twist. Our conversation today will have a special focus on trees and what they do for society, an important role that trees play and forests play in wildfire prevention. It's a fantastic topic with two truly amazing leaders in this field. So before we get started, a huge thanks to our co-hosting organizations today, American Forest, Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, the Metro Hartford Alliance, TrustedChoice.com, the National Association of Professional Insurance Agents, the Masters in FinTech program at UConn, the Center for Risk and Uncertainty Management at the University of South Carolina Business School, and Connecticut Business and Industry Association. That's a mouthful, so thank you all for co-hosting. We're going to start today's program with an opening presentation from two leaders in this field, followed by a discussion, and then your questions. So get those ready. You're going to drop them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So let's get started, folks. Our first speaker today is Jad Daley, the 40th president and CEO of American Forest, the nation's oldest forest conservation organization, founded in 1875. Jad has a long record of leadership in this area. He's authored federal legislation, is regularly featured in national media, and is co-author of multiple scientific studies related all to forest and conservation. Jad is also the co-founder and co-chair of OneT.org, which is a global platform dedicated to conserving, restoring, and growing 1 trillion trees. That's a lot of trees by 2030. So after our opening with Jad, we're going to be joined by Travelers Executive Vice President and my good friend, Michael Klein, who serves as president of our personal insurance business today and has spearheaded this truly unique relationship with American Forest. This started to encourage all of our customers to adopt paperless billing. So we're going to hear more about that from Michael in a minute. Before personal insurance, Michael led our middle market business. He served as president of commercial accounts and was senior vice president of our industry and product group. He joined the company in 1990 and has held various positions in commercial insurance, underwriting knowledge management, corporate planning and development, among many other things he does for us. So with that, I'm going to turn the virtual floor over to Jad for his opening presentation. And thank you both so much for joining me today.
Great, thanks so much. Grateful to join you all today, and so my task here in the opening of this webinar is to set some framing for what's happening with wildfire today, and how do we move together as a community to take action on it and to protect our communities more effectively. Look, here's the goal. You all do incredible work in the insurance community to keep our communities safe and resilient, and I'm just really grateful for that. And so what I want to talk about is what are these complementary actions that we can take in reducing the risk of wildfire to enhance our ability to do that? What are the ways in which we can reduce these risks and help individuals and communities take actions to enhance their own resilience? And the first thing I want to do is just to frame out what's really at stake with the threat of wildfire to our communities across America today. And I'm guessing many people on this call are focused on those first couple pieces, direct threats to lives and property from wildfire across America. And of course, that is the leading edge of what's at stake. But I want to note that there's a ripple effect of impact across our communities, and it includes threats to infrastructure, the fact that wildfire destabilizes landscapes in ways that, for example, leads to mudslides that knock out highways, across the western United States, just as an example, that the smoke from wildfire has become a major impact on respiratory health all across America, not just nearby where wildfires are occurring, but literally across the entire entirety of the United States, that our drinking water supplies that come from our forests are impacted and are less effectively filtered and collected and filtered after wildfire. Trails and recreation opportunities, the ability of our forests to generate forest products, habitat for wildlife, and the ability of our forests to sequester carbon dioxide and help us slow climate change. So really, this just incredible suite of forest benefits are all at stake when wildfires damage our forests, and if we don't repair them appropriately. And so it's just absolutely critical that we address both the threat side of this and the benefit side of it in terms of how we confront wildfire. American Forest, I'm proud to say, has been on the wildfire crisis from from the very beginning. American Forest is the oldest forest conservation organization in America. We were founded in 1875. And in fact, the impacts of wildfire all the way back then, almost 150 years ago, was one of the driving forces that led concerned citizens to found American Forests, and ultimately, early on in the history of the organization, bring people together from across America in the first American Forest Congress to identify the problems and identify how we can take action together with things like public policy and different kinds of partnerships to better take care of our forests, including helping them become more resilient to wildfire. And that carries all the way forward today into some really exciting, very current public policy wins that we've had and new partnerships to deal with wildfire at the scale of the crisis that we're seeing today. And so a couple ways that in particular our organization is leaning into this. First of all, we're really proud that my colleague Brian Kittler, who leads our Resilient Forest program, that's all of our work outside of cities, was named to the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission that was established by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And this was really an unprecedented effort to bring together leaders from across the public and private sector to assess the scale of the wildfire crisis that we face today, how it's changed, and how we need to change our response with things like public policy and partnerships and investment at all levels of our society, public and private sector alike. And so Brian was part of crafting an incredible suite of proposed solutions from that commission that we're now working to help implement through public policy and through other measures. And we have published a forward-looking policy prescription that you can find online on American Forest website, outlining what we think are some of the most key policy measures that we can take to support an effective wildfire resilience response. And so the first thing to understand about how wildfire has changed is how the scale of it has changed. Across the Western United States, for example, the extent of wildfire has more than doubled in just the last few decades. And in California, and this map that you see here, and the scale of wildfire in California exemplifies this trend. In fact, the extent of wildfire has more than tripled in California in just the last few decades. But it's really important to understand that while we might, for many people, might jump to this as a Western issue, it is now becoming an issue across the entire United States and across all of Canada as well. And that's been exemplified by the Canada fires last summer and reaching parts of Canada that were previously thought not to be at risk of wildfire, for example, in Eastern Canada and central parts of Canada. But also just this fall, we've seen wildfire threats and wildfire exposure in the northeastern United States and mid-Atlantic United States at scales that we've never seen before. In New England, we used to jokingly call them the asbestos forest because they were, the forests are naturally so moist in New England, but just generally have not been thought to be at risk of wildfires. And yet, for example, in Connecticut, we've seen some extensive wildfire activity this fall. And so we really need to think about this now because of the way our forests are being changed by changing climate. The risk and the threat of wildfire is extending into places that we didn't think we needed to manage for wildfire resilience in the past. And that's one sort of conceptual change we need to make. But really importantly, it's not just that more land is burning, but it's that land is burning more intensively, and it's leaving our forests more intensively damaged as a result. And so that makes them less likely to recover. And so as a result, we have a lot more land that we need to actively restore and reforest after wildfire. And this graph that you see here, just showing, for example, in California, the shift in the percentage of land burned in California burning so intensively that it won't grow back. This is leading to millions more acres across California, across the West, and increasingly across the United States, where we need to be able to step in after wildfire and do post fire reforestation and do it in a way that we set those lands up that they won't just burn catastrophically again in the way that they have in the past. So in terms of conceptual frameworks, what I want to help us think about is we really need a holistic approach. In the past, we've thought about wildfire predominantly in that middle part. What do we do during wildfire? And how are we fighting fires? And that part does have to change. Really importantly, there's good fire and bad fire. Some fires are helpful if they're at the right scale and intensity that can actually help clear out our forests, and regular fires of the right intensity are actually part of keeping our forests from catastrophic burns. The problem is now that we have so many areas of our forests with dead and dying trees, with greater aridity than ever before, dried out in ways that they haven't ever been in recent history, it leaves some of these areas vulnerable to catastrophic wildfires, the kinds that I've described. And so part of the during change is that we have to be very specific in using data and science to evaluate where do we want to let fires burn and where do we want to fight them to avoid those catastrophic wildfires. So that's a really important shift in the during part. In terms of preventing those fires in the first place, we need to do a lot more work before fire occurs, going into our forests, identifying those areas where forests are out of balance with their environment, where trees are dead and dying at incredible, unprecedented rates, and where therefore they're just tinder waiting to be lit, and go in and do things like prescribed burning, things like thinning forests, so that we can get them to the right health and balance so that when wildfire does come through, it doesn't burn catastrophically. So there's been a wonderful effort at play to really dramatically ramp up things like prescribed burning, things like thinning forests that can keep our forests healthy and in balance and ready for wildfire in the right ways. And then lastly, as I referred to before, we just have to move much more quickly and far more extensively in reforesting after wildfire with climate-informed approaches, resilience-informed approaches, where we're reforesting these areas in a way that they're designed not only not to burn catastrophically again, but to be more easily managed with tools like prescribed fire. So that's the work that we have to do out there in big natural landscapes where a lot of these fires originate, and really all the way down to the edges of our communities. But we also have work to do in our communities, and Michael will speak more about this in a bit. But we have to work right in and around homes to create defensible space. And that starts most importantly right adjacent to homes. So we're reducing the potential for embers from fires to come in and ignite right around homes. And then we need to create a sense of radiation of defensible space, of thinned areas. So we can still have trees and shrubs on our properties, but we need to make sure that they're aligned in a way that these properties are wildfire resilient. Now, implementing the kinds of solutions that I've talked about, whether it's ramping up that work that we need to do before to thin our forest and prepare our forests for wildfire, whether it's how we fight fires, or whether it's reforestation after fires, is complicated. And no, you're not supposed to absorb this entire slide. In fact, it's meant to be confusing on purpose to show you all these different interconnecting variables that impact our ability to get this response right. This complexity that you're looking at is why we haven't yet been able to ramp up the things we need to do in our forests, like thinning and burning them before wildfire, at the scale and pace that's necessary. So this is what we're trying to solve for before, during, and after, so you can really understand the complexity. And you can understand some of the hidden levers in here, like social license. For example, communities being willing to accept the smoke that comes with prescribed burns, understanding that that smoke is an inconvenience and in some cases a health issue they need to manage, but that's balanced against the benefits that it provides in keeping us safe from wildfire. These are the complexities that we're trying to deal with in advancing a wildfire resilience response. And so I want to close with an exciting success story of how we're really starting to move on this agenda at a scale that we never have before. And I'm going to focus this as a piece particularly on the after fire side of things, how we respond post-fire, and on our national forests. And the fact is that our national forests have accumulated a 3.6 million acre backlog of burned and degraded lands that we haven't had the funding historically to be able to reforest. And so these are lands that are remaining a hazard to our communities, as well as not providing all those benefits that we get from forests. And so American Forest dug in first on the public policy side with bipartisan group of lawmakers to pass something called the Replant Act, which gives the Forest Service a 5 to 10-fold permanent increase in the amount of funding that's available to the Forest Service to catch up and keep up on this reforestation challenge. And now we've launched a new Keystone partnership with the Forest Service to help them implement that funding and get that scaling up of reforestation right. So we're reforesting these lands in ways that they won't just burn catastrophically again. And so the leading edge of that I've sort of alluded to a few times, but I want to be more specific on here, is really leaning into the science of what does wildfire resilient reforestation look like? How do we have to change the way that we reforest these lands so they don't just burn catastrophically again? And what it essentially comes down to is how we assess the site and really understand each site for how it can uniquely support forests that can survive into the future. And that involves things like adjusting the tree species and even the genetics of those trees so that we're picking the right trees that are naturally wildfire resilient. Changing the way that we plant them, the number of trees, the density of trees to match, for example, the amount of water that's available on a landscape so the forest can remain healthy. And then understanding that we're going to need to manage those landscapes in an ongoing way with things like prescribed fire to keep them wildfire resilient. That's what we're mapping out. We're using our scientific smarts, landscape by landscape, post burn, burn scar by burn scar. We're mapping out that scientific prescription in partnership with the Forest Service. To implement that, back to the complexity of this, is it takes a whole supply chain to deliver that solution. It isn't just about grabbing a bunch of trees and running out there and planting. But to implement that solution that I just described, you need to have enough trees, you need to have the right trees, you need to have the projects designed and the workforce ready to go out and do that work. And so I'm proud that what we have designed with the Forest Service is this whole supply chain model, things like how do we collect enough of the right seeds to grow enough of the right seedlings to do this work. We're working at this whole scale of complexity with the Forest Service to scale up reforestation 5 to 10-fold on our national forests and to do it the right way so these landscapes won't just burn again. And I'm really proud to say we're making incredible progress. This is data from just the first 2 years of implementing the Replant Act. And through this partnership, scaling up reforestation done the right way on our national forests. And in fact, this data is soon to be trumped by new data from the Forest Service that will show in the first 3 years of the Replant Act implementation at the end of this year, we will have reforested over 500,000 acres of national forest land, brought it back into resilient forest, and we'll have closed about 15% of the backlog of lands, an area, by the way, the size of Connecticut, travelers. There's 3.6 million acres of burned and degraded lands that we're fixing with this effort. We will have closed 15% of that backlog, over 500,000 acres by the end of this calendar year. We're really proud of that progress. And so really importantly, that's just the beginning. We need that kind of success in the taking action before, the taking action during, as well as taking action after. And it needs to be on all lands, not just National Forest System lands. So as Joan alluded to, I'm really proud that we and Travelers are part of a group called 1T.org, a global partnership to get this kind of work done at the right scale, and particularly the US chapter of that global partnership of different diverse organizations, state governments like Washington State Department of Natural Resources that's been a partner with us and with the Forest Service and others in doing this work. Partners like the National Alliance of Forest Owners that are bringing large landowners in to, in some cases, even do work on federal lands where the federal government doesn't have enough capacity, and advocating together for the kind of public sector investment that we need, as we had, for example, through the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, in all the different actions that we need to take before, during, and after. So look forward to getting into more details about how we implement this approach across America in the rest of the discussion. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Jad. It's great to be here with you. And before I share a couple of remarks to supplement what you had to share, I want to do two quick things. First, thank Joan and the Travelers Institute team for having both of us here to talk about this important topic. And two, acknowledge that as we sit here today having this conversation, we have an active wildfire situation in Malibu, California. And I want to send our thoughts and prayers out to those that are dealing with that situation, either personally or they're on the ground, helping to try to fight that fire. But it's, and it's interesting sitting here in Connecticut today where we're going to get 2 or 3 inches of rain, right? To believe that at the opposite end of the spectrum, we're dealing with a very rapidly evolving and active wildfire situation at exactly the same time. But I think it does do a lot to highlight the importance of this issue that we're here to talk about today. If you all took nothing else away from Jad's opening, hopefully one of the things you took away from it is why we at Travelers are so proud to partner with American Forests. Just in that, 10-minute opening, I think you saw the evidence of the passion, the expertise, the dedication, the focus that he and his team bring to this issue that is so important for all of us. And I'm proud to be able to say that we've been partnering with American Forest now for more than 7 years, and have worked together to plant more than 5 million trees over that time frame. But I also want to share that it's not just a corporation cutting checks to a foundation. It goes much deeper than that. In fact, a number of members of the senior leadership team at Travelers, Joan Woodward, myself included, make an annual personal contribution to American Forests to offset the carbon footprint associated with our travel to our largest business conference of the year. And beyond that, it also extends into sweat equity. Right? We have done almost 60 projects with American Forest over the past 5 years, involving hundreds of Travelers employees and our agency partners in fighting the good fight and working in partnership with American Forest to advance these initiatives. So, we are thrilled with the partnership, happy to be here to talk more about it. And then just taking a step back and teeing up some of what we'll talk about the rest of the afternoon. First, you heard it from Jad, but I would reiterate, right? From a Travelers perspective, we believe forests are important. We see evidence of global warming and climate change increasing the intensity of a variety of catastrophes, including wildfire, but also extending to significant rainfall, flooding, and wind and hail and tornado exposure that certainly impacts our communities and impacts our business. Trees are a great part of the solution, right? They reduce greenhouse gas and help lower temperature, but they also have broader benefits, and Jad alluded to some of those, and we'll talk more about some of those, but they also help improve air quality. I will also admit that when we started the partnership with American Forests, Jad said it a second ago. He said it's not just grabbing a bunch of trees and running out and planting them. That's actually what I thought it was when we started the partnership, and we were happy to do it because we thought that was a good thing. But clearly, just simply planting trees isn't sufficient. You heard Jad talk about how responsible reforestation requires a special approach. And we work with American Forest very specifically on targeted plantings of the right species in the right places to solve for the right issues, whether that is responsible wildfire-resistant reforestation in more rural areas, or whether that's urban reforestation to improve tree equity in urban areas, which is, again, another topic that we will talk more about. But certainly, I'm not the tree expert. I'm not the forest expert on this call, but I do want to just demonstrate that we spend time with Jad and the experts to ensure that the work we're doing is done appropriately and done well. We'll also then spend some time, as Jad alluded to, talking about the fact that forests are part of the solution, but there are other elements of the solution to defending against wildfires. Some of that solution is literally the active response to a wildfire event, providing resources to our agents and our customers to be able to defend structures against wildfires that are happening. Most of that is not what you see pictures of on the news of somebody coming in and spraying foam on the house to keep it from burning. Most of that is actually more active management of the property, taping vents closed, moving debris away from the home, and creating less opportunity for the fire to spread to the structure. But importantly, most of the work that we can do to help protect structures from fires is work that happens well in advance of a fire burning on the ground. And so that includes work that we can do in terms of the way the homes are constructed or the way homes are renovated. It includes managing the landscaping and the tree density and the defensible space around the structure. And so hopefully by the end of our conversation this afternoon, you'll come away with a few tips and tricks that you can use or you can advise your clients to use to be able to better help them protect and harden their homes and their residences from wildfire risk. And I look forward to engaging in that conversation as we go forward. And with that, I think I'll welcome Joan and Jad back and we'll start the discussion.
All right, sounds great. Michael, Jad, thanks so much for your comments. And as you can hear, this is a huge priority for the company, and we're just pleased to have this partnership, of course. So, Jad, I want to get to you first because I want to talk about data. We slice and dice data here. We're very analytical, as you know, in the insurance industry. But as a baseline, can you put some data around? We know intuitively that trees are good for the planet and for our health, but what are the range of benefits? Can you quantify some of these things for us?
Joan, normally I would start with clean air and water, but actually in response, I was reading the questions that came in, and I want to actually start with a benefit that responds to a number of questions, which are, what about logging for forest product? I talked about prescribed burning and thinning, but a number of folks were asking, what do you think about, managing our forests for forest products as well, which of course it also has the effect of thinning them and making them less vulnerable to wildfire. And I want to make really clear, American Forest is very supportive of forest products as a benefit for our economy, for the environment. It's the space age materials solution that's been with us all along, that is renewable and beneficial for us in so many different ways. In fact, so statistic number one is that the forest products industry alone in the United States supports almost 1 million jobs and 4% of the manufacturing economy. So healthy and resilient forests, we can manage them to renewably produce forest products of all sorts of diverse kinds, and that are a real benefit for our society on multiple levels. But let's get to the clean air and water part. Michael alluded to this. Our forests are an amazing filtration system. And so the forests of the United States capture more than 17 million metric tons of air pollution on an annual basis. They also naturally sequester about 750 million metric tons of carbon dioxide on an annual basis, which is like 16% of all the carbon dioxide emissions in the United States. So they're just our forests are an unbelievably powerful air filtration system that for our health and for regulating our climate and dealing with the climate challenge that Michael alluded to. I also want to just talk about as such an important common need that we have across our communities, and the fact that well over half of our drinking water supplies in America come from our forests. In California, by the way, it's over 60% of the water supplies in California come from the Sierra Nevada alone. And this all across the country. Zoom across to my native state of New Jersey, where the most densely populated state in the country, where the water primarily comes from places like the Pinelands and the Highlands, the few large forest blocks that are left in that densely populated state. So this is our water filtration system, as well as our air filtration system. And then lastly, wildlife and recreation. Over 80% of wildlife species live in forests. And so the health of our forests is the health of our ecosystems and biodiversity. And it's also the ability for all of us to go out and enjoy these places. I looked up a pretty amazing statistic that the Department of Commerce just found, that the outdoor recreation industry is an over $1 trillion now contributor to our economy. Our national forests alone get 160 million visits. So when they're burning down, that's impacting the ability of people to go out and enjoy our forests. And by the way, also lift our economy in the process. So I could actually keep going, but I'll stop there. It's just our forests are this gift they keep on giving, and how we help them through this wildfire crisis, help them become resilient, really healthy and resilient in the face of wildfire, is just pivotal for keeping all those benefits flowing to our society.
All right. Thank you so much, Jad. I really appreciate you quantifying that. All right, audience, get ready. We're going to ask you a polling question. We do this on occasion. So for all of my friends out there, I want to know, I have received a red flag warning in my community over the last several months. So how many people have received this red flag warning? And let me just talk about what is a red flag warning. It means when warm temperatures, very low humidity, stronger winds are expected, combined to produce an increased risk of fire danger. And so how many people out there have got that red flag warning? Okay, we're looking at some results coming in now. Wow, this looks to be about half of the audience is saying they received a red flag warning in the last few months in their communities. So that seems to be a lot of people, half of my audience. Michael, so where and when are these wildfires occurring today? In the US, obviously, people typically think it's on the West Coast and it's not their problem. But how should we be thinking about more broadly? And, really, who needs to pay attention to this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joan. I think, it's intriguing. Like if I could ask two follow-ups to that question, I'd ask, where is everybody? And what you would find is they're not all in the Western US. And then the other question I would ask is the first time you got one, did you know what it was?
Yeah, right.
Because, I mean, we're in the business. We partner with Jad and the team. I live in Connecticut and I got multiple this year. And the first time I got one, I was like, what's a red flag warning? And I think that illustrates the point, right? There was a time, I think, when the perception broadly was this is not only a West Coast thing, this is a California thing. Or maybe they only happen in California, the Sierra Nevadas. But we have seen, I mean, since our partnership with American Forest began in 2017, we have seen wildfires extend from Southern California to British Columbia, Canada, to Eastern Canada, to the South Central United States, and to the Northeast, right? Just this fall, Metro North was closed due to a brush fire, right? We had wildfires burning in the state of New Jersey a month ago. Most folks can remember when we had the orange haze over the northern US for weeks on end due to the wildfires in eastern Canada that Jad mentioned earlier. So this is not an issue that only is relevant to a subset of the population in the country or on this call. This is an issue that's relevant to all of us. And it is exacerbated by the extreme fluctuations in weather. Again, as I mentioned, 2 to 3 inches of rain falling here in Connecticut today, and wind-driven wildfire in Southern California at the same time. Those extremes in heavy precipitation followed by lack of precipitation, and going from the spring that we had here in the Northeast where we had too much rain to a dry summer and actually shifting back into drought conditions this fall is what leads to the conditions that support those wildfires and increase that wildfire risk.
Okay, thank you for that. So what are the lessons learned, maybe Jad, from some recent fires? What have we learned and taken away from those?
Yeah, I think to keep it sort of pithy for people, when we thin, we win, which is a little bit of shorthand for thinking about it. I mean, when we treat our forests, prescribe fire, thinning, when we have active management of a forest that's producing forest products, and so that we have more active management of all kinds in these wildfire-prone areas, that is that's sort of the foundation of wildfire resilience. What we do before, everything else is a rearguard action after, and so one of the things we must do is make sure that we're investing at the same scale in these actions that increase resilience alongside the actions that are helping us fight fires when they do occur, and that after part as well. And so I want to give a great example, the Caldor fire, which was a particularly damaging fire in California that kind of raged out of control and was surging across the mountains, the Sierra Nevada mountains. When it reached South Lake Tahoe, there was an area that had been intensively thinned over many, many years as part of a really thoughtful multi-year wildfire resilience project. And the wildfire, dropped dramatically. It was also complemented by defensible space actions that had taken in the community. So there was less for firefighters to have to, in terms of embers flying into community and creating fires within the community. And so basically the wildfire response was able to push it away and direct it away from South Lake Tahoe. And it's really been viewed by many folks. There's been some debate in the forestry community of some folks saying, hey, can we really fix this? Should we just let it all burn and kind of let our forest sort it out? And I think what we're seeing again and again is proof positive that we can't afford to do that. Our forests are so out of sync, as Michael's been describing, and significantly because of climate change, our forests are so out of sync with the natural rhythms and the natural fire regimes that we can't let them sort it out. We have to make these interventions that sort of get them ready and resilient for wildfire. And this work in South Lake Tahoe that protected this community from the Caldor fire, I think is just really proof positive that's the approach that we need again and again and again, all across the most fire vulnerable communities. And really now we need to get ahead of that by saying we need to do that in most fire vulnerable communities and start working in other areas where we can start to anticipate elevated fire risk. Some of the places that Michael's talked about in the eastern United States, for example, where if in a place like the Pine Barrens region of New Jersey, if wildfire ever increases to the scale there that we're seeing in the West, there's a lot of homes and lives at risk. And so this is the time to actually work ahead of the curve in those places where wildfire risk is rising at the same time that we're doubling down our efforts in the places that are in the thick of it right now.
So just to follow up on that, what tips the scale between a naturally occurring beneficial fire and one that causes the widespread destruction? Can you give us the, how to think about that?
Thanks, Joan. It's exactly the right question, I think it really more than anything comes down to the condition of the forest when the wildfire hits. And so I want to give an example that will help people understand the magnitude of the way that our forests have changed, and therefore wildfire risk has changed. Is that wildfires have only burned over and kind of up and over and down the other side of the Sierra Nevada twice, and it's happened both within the last couple of years. And that's because the drying effect that Michael described, literally baking our forests dry with a changing climate, combined with forest health challenges. For example, as our forests dry out and become weakened, they're less able to resist things like pine beetles. And so it's this synergistic effect of a drying a forest that leads to making them more vulnerable to other kinds of forest threats, including ones that in some cases have been there all along. And that combined effect of the weakening of our forests means that fires can just burn in places that they haven't before, and with this increased intensity. So the fact that they can now burn up and over the Sierra Nevada in places that used to be essentially inflammable is, to me, kind of proof positive that it's all about forest condition. That's the limiter on this, where fires can go and how intensely they'll burn, or the driver of how intensely they'll burn. And so that's why we really, in terms of this risk assessment and prioritizing where we need to take action, and I'm sure there'll be questions folks will have about, how does this change our understanding of risk factors? We really need to look at the condition of the forest in different places to help us understand risk in all the nuanced ways that are necessary for prioritization, and how we deal with this crisis.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go some rapid fire questions. I want to talk about reforestation and kind of protecting your communities. So couple of questions here. How much land needs to be reforested today in the US? And how do you know what kind of trees to plant? Michael had raised this and I never really thought about the different kinds of trees. So if one were to take this on in their own community, can you give us some advice?
Absolutely. Well, the number one thing to say is that writ large, we have identified in a tool that I believe has been put in the chat here called the Reforestation Hub. It's reforestationhub.org. 148 million acres of different kinds of reforestation opportunities all across America. And look, I just need to stop and say Travelers has been the most amazing partner, our single largest partner, by the way, in doing that work of reforestation in every manifestation, from reforesting these burned areas to bringing trees in cities as nature's air conditioning in the neighborhoods that need them the most. So we have been working across this whole spectrum of all these more tree opportunities. But to sort of bring that down to another scale that people can kind of wrap their heads around, as I mentioned, the U.S. Forest Service alone has identified this 3.6 million acres, an area the size of Connecticut, to put that in scale, of land that needs to be reforested. Across all public lands in the United States, we've identified an area the size of West Virginia, about 17 million acres of land that needs to be reforested, predominantly from wildfire, but with a couple of other causes as well. So I hope that's helpful for people, but we're talking about an area the size of Connecticut, an area the size of West Virginia. There's a lot at stake there. That's a lot of forest benefit for our country to do that work. And so to your question about the right tree, how do we make sure we're doing that the right way? We have a range of different resources. We have a how to plant a tree section on the American Forest website, which includes information about not just how to plant a tree, but how to select the right tree for homeowners' goals or for communities' goals, and that all the way to the kind of very sophisticated, deeply science-based planning, like the one that the example that I showed in my presentation, where in that case, we're looking at an area of about 1 million acres of land in Oregon, and across this vast area, doing this analysis to think about all of the different tree species and genetics questions and how they're planted questions at the scale of a large reforestation effort like that. So we have a really range of scientific tools that we're excited to share with people, depending on how they're touching in on this, whether it's at the homeowner level or whether it's being involved in some of these larger scale efforts. And I think, from our perspective, our organization is committed not just to doing more, but we have to do it better. If we don't get the science right, just planting more trees that are just going to burn again catastrophically, for example, is not a win. It's actually a step backwards, and we have to get those kinds of scientific details right.
Okay, thank you for that. So, Michael, I want to pull you back in here. So, under your leadership, Travelers decided to get involved, and as Jad just said, one of the largest partners in reforestation with his group. So, why is it that we're involved? And actually, what is our program? So, if you go paperless billing, tell us about what our program is and why we're doing this.
Sure. So, our program is we plant a tree for in a variety of situations depending upon our interaction with our customers. The biggest volume of trees that we plant is we plant a tree for every customer that elects to go paperless. It's a great win-win-win, right? It's a win for the environment. The tree gets planted. It's a win for American Forest because it advances their goals and their objectives. It's a win for us because we save the money of printing the paper and sending it out. And it's a win for the customer because it's part of a better digital customer experience. And so that one to us is where most of the energy and effort is. But we also, as I mentioned, our management team, you and I both, Joan, contribute to planting trees to offset the carbon emissions associated with some of the events that we do as part of our overall, environmental program here at the Travelers. We plant trees for customers who participate in a program that we have called Travantage, which is a way for Travelers customers to get discounts on a number of products that they buy. And more recently, we actually started to plant trees in honor of customers who passed away.
Wonderful. Wow. I didn't know that last part. So that's wonderful, Michael. And thank you again for introducing our company to this amazing nonprofit. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about practical things. I like to do this on my webinars, very practical things that you can advise our audience. There's substantial research out there demonstrating how we can protect ourselves, how we can be more resilient. So what are the steps to start creating that wildfire resistant yard around our homes, Michael?
Sure, Joan, it's a great question, and I'll ask us to put up a couple of visuals to support this one. And it really is, you can sort of think of it, and Jad had a visual of defensible space that was sort of concentric rings around the home. I'll show it from a little bit of a different visual, but you can sort of think of what you can do that way, and really does start with the structure. The way your home is built originally, or modifications that you can make to the structure in the area around the home that can make it more defensible. Joan, both you and I have been to the Insurance Institute for Building and Home Safety, which is where this visual comes from, where they actually do test burns of structures to help better understand what materials are more resistant and what fire building approaches are more resistant. And so in this picture, you see a number of those elements, whether it's the rating of your roof and the non-combustible gutters and downspouts you see mentioned there. You can install different attic vents in your home that are more ember resistant. In fact, one of the main causes of houses to burn in wildfires is embers get into the attic through the vents, and then the fire starts in the attic, and that is actually how the house ultimately burns. And so one of the first things our wildfire defense partners do when they respond to a wildfire event is go tape those vents up. But you can actually install vents that are more ember resistant to keep those embers from getting into your attic. Then you sort of go from the structure to what's next to the structure, and I won't cover all of it here, but I'm sure a number of folks on this call have fences around their homes. And my guess is many of those are wood fences, and my guess is most of those wood fences abut the house, right? And actually the wood fence comes up and comes in contact to the house. Another key source of ignition for a house burning in a wildfire is the fence starts on fire, and then that fire spreads to the home. And so what you see on the right-hand slide here is, this is I think looks like a chain link gate, but if you intersperse a metal or fire resistant section of fence in the portion of the fence that touches the house. That's another good way to prevent or allow your house to sustain a wildfire for longer. And again, I won't cover all the detail here. You see the link in the chat. A lot of this is available through ibhs.org, which is an industry organization that we participate in that helps folks manage, again, wildfire defense and other property protection issues. This is actually a different representation of what Jad talked about, but as you go further and further away from the home, you manage it differently, right? So once you get 5 feet away from the home, there may be places where you can have the right types of trees, but what you don't want is you don't want a tree that's going to have a lot of combustible material in proximity to the house. So you see removing the overhanging tree branches because they're more likely to help that fire spread. Then when you get further away from the house even more, this is where Jad says, right, it's the right trees in the right places. And so if he said, when we thin, we win. That's represented by removing bushes from underneath trees, right? You're trying to spread out the ignition sources on the property further away from the home and further away from each other, because one of the things that happens in a wildfire situation is if you get multiple sources of ignition in proximity to each other and they all light up, that usually is the thing that's the catalyst for that fire to spread further.
Okay, so let's move quickly from the yard, which was a terrific explanation of what you should be doing, to the home itself. So there are opportunities exist there to better protect our homes. I know IBHS has some more research on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that is the home construction. I guess one other thing that I would mention is just, the way that you manage it. So we didn't talk about, and that picture didn't have, for example, a picture of the deck in the backyard, right? But how many of us have a deck on the back of our house and we store a bunch of stuff underneath it, right? The wildfire demonstration, Joan, that you and I saw at IBHS, there was a cornhole game underneath the deck made out of wood, right? So now you've got a wood ignition source underneath your house. So in addition to the structure and the surrounding environment, sort of the way that you maintain and manage your home is another way that you can really protect yourself.
Okay, so we're talking a lot about planting trees, but insurance companies, as you know, Michael, of course, sometimes recommend removing trees from your property. Can you talk about those distinctions and why we're asking clients or customers to remove trees? And what is your advice for those folks out there to have trees near your home?
Sure. I think, I think this is where, Jad talks about it being complicated, and I'm sure he'll comment, right? So, on the one hand, from a climate and a cooling standpoint, trees near the home help provide shade, keep the home cooler. You don't need to run your air conditioning. So from a broad sort of balancing the equation from an environment standpoint, trees providing shade to the home can be helpful. That said, from a wildfire protection standpoint, they're ignition sources. And from a wind and hail and tornado standpoint, they are essentially missiles or damaging elements that when they come in contact with the house cause damage. So broadly speaking, from a managing your property standpoint, large trees next to the home are a challenge for a variety of reasons. And that's why you will see us and others come to policyholders and say, cut those overhanging branches because they could fall on the house or they could be a wildfire ignition source, and plant the trees further away from the property. But again, it's a balancing act.
Great. All right, Jed, same question to you. You all have some great advice for homeowners about how to plant a tree, what trees to pick. Can you share any tips for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, I think Michael just said something really important, which is this is a multivariable equation, and it's the calculus if you're in a wildfire prone area is different from if you're in an area that isn't. And so I think part of the responsibility for us is to provide guidance about tree selection and about tree placement and management that really understands those nuances and help folks make good decisions in the context that they're in. And so I think that's really the first piece of it, is for each homeowner to assess the different kind of risk factors and also the goals that they have. That natural cooling goal is really, really profound. You can reduce the cooling load within a home by as much as half with well-placed trees. And they don't have to be directly adjacent to the home. They can be strategically, placed around a home that's far enough away to protect the home, and yet also to provide the right kind of shade and the right types of cooling benefit. And so that's just a perfect example of one of those benefits we want to provide, but let's do it the right way in terms of understanding the nuances of each site. So resources that we've provided, we've tried to provide some of that kind of information. But there's also, I think, really important for homeowners to consider working with a local tree care company or other a professional expert who can come in and do a very site-specific analysis for them to identify how to optimize these tree benefits. And then I think the other piece of the equation is, about how trees are planted and cared for, because unfortunately planting a tree is a lot easier than having one be healthy and survive that establishment period, as well as be maintained in a way that it doesn't develop risks over time. As Michael said, for example, trimming branches as the tree grows, so you keep it within the space that you had originally identified. And so I think people really understanding that they need to budget for and plan for that ongoing maintenance, some of which they might do themselves over time, some of which they might bring in a tree care company to help with over time, is definitely part of the calculus in coming up with a really informed plan for trees around the home. And let me just add one last thing. Joan, just to say that I think, part of the equation here is what people are doing on their own properties, but part of it is also all of us being sort of informed and active citizens on behalf of the whole equation that we've talked about here, what's happening around our communities and what's happening in our communities. And, I talked a couple times today about the social license that we need, for example, to support government agencies like the Forest Service, doing prescribed burns around our communities, knowing that, the smoke that's created and maybe folks worrying about the damage that might be happening to their forests is actually protecting the communities, actually enhancing the resilience and complementing the actions that homeowners are taking right around their own property. So I think there's we need to take care of our own backyards, but we all need to think about ourselves as champions for and voices for supporting those larger actions that are also part of the total equation that we need for wildfire resilience in our country.
Okay, great. I want to pivot right before we get to audience questions, where we're going to get to next. Let's talk about public policy. So, Jad, you worked on several pieces of legislation that became law in Washington. What's happening now? What's the latest policy work out there?
Well, here's the great news. We've had some massive wins on wildfire resilience in recent years. There was something called the wildfire funding fix that was implemented about 7 or 8 years ago, which helped start to fix the Forest Service's in particular budget issues and give the Forest Service access to more money to do wildfire response and to combat wildfires as they're occurring. And then in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a huge billions of dollars of new funding, over $5 billion alone in the bipartisan infrastructure law, provided to the Forest Service and the Department of Interior in particular to go out and do work on public lands, as well as to give grants to communities to do the kind of work that we've talked about: thinning forests, prescribed burning, active management in different ways to bring our forests into balance so that they're more wildfire resilient. So we're finally getting the scale of investment to where it needs to be on both fighting fires and those preventative actions. And then lastly, as I referred to with the Replant Act, also what we're doing after wildfire as well. So we're really investing across that whole spectrum at a whole new scale, thanks to wins like the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now, there was a question in the chat, well, what's going to happen now? Is it with the new administration and the new Congress, is that kind of activity going to slow? And actually, I would suggest it will at least maintain the same pace, if not even increase. The Trump administration in the first go-around was very proactive about wanting to increase forest management to address the wildfire risk. And we've seen again and again in Congress, this is a bipartisan solution. Yeah. Everyone is experiencing the damage from wildfire. Everyone's benefiting from the solutions. And so I think we're going to see even increased funding in the years ahead across that whole spectrum of before, during, and after.
Great. Michael, there's a question coming in from the audience here. What about the role of zoning enforcement and building codes? Where are we in terms of that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joan. And I guess fortunately or unfortunately, right, zoning is local, right? And so you see great examples of communities in California as one example of trying to make the community more defensible. Right, we talked about this as a concentric circle, and we talked about the house We talked about the yard, but the environment around the house and the yard is where, in most cases, the wildfire begins or where it gets most of its fuel. And so communities working to manage the forest in their community, the communities working to pass zoning laws that restrict the proximity of construction of one home to another, right? Once a wildfire moves from the rural area into the urban area, the primary source of fuel are the structures. And so space between structures becomes important. And so, communities coming together both to manage the forest in and around the structures, but also to manage the zoning and construction standards for the structures can be an important part of the solution. And we've seen it work in hurricane. Right? We've got examples of, again, another program of IBHS called Fortified, which is a set of construction standards for roofing and attaching the roof and the structure to the foundation of a home, how much better those homes perform in the event of a hurricane than ones that aren't built to those standards. Construction standards and zoning laws can make a big difference.
Okay. We're going to get to more questions here from the audience. But Michael, first, have you learned anything that really surprised you as part of this partnership and work on these forest issues?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, and again, I thought Jad said it well when he said it's not just grabbing a bunch of trees and sticking them in the ground. I mean, literally, before we started working with American Forests, that's mostly what I thought it was. And what you find when you spend time with people like Jad and you invest more time and energy in partnerships like this one, again, you find the science that they espouse. You see the rigor that they use when they execute. And Jad's, I think, done a great job of describing it, but I would describe it as, this is not just about planting trees and ecosystems and forests for the sake of forests, right? The impact of these initiatives is so multifaceted. It's got economic impact, it's got socioeconomic impact beyond environmental and climate impact. It's just you get a lot of bang for your buck when you spend $1 on a tree.
Awesome. All right, Jad, question coming in from Gary Russell in Colorado. He wants to know, is there a wildfire risk zone map or zip code list available? Is there such things?
Absolutely. In fact, right now there are a number of them, and there's a great one that FEMA has done recently. That's an online tool that I think is worth noting, and I might have even put that in response to a question earlier, but I can throw it in the chat if that's helpful. But one of the things I think is exciting is you have government resources like that and other agencies at the federal and state level that have produced wildfire risk information that I think is high quality. But with AI, now what you have are private sector efforts as well that are being launched that are both doing a better job of managing risk in ways that can inform homeowners and insurers, for example, but also that can inform things like where do we want to let fires burn and where are we going to get, to your earlier question, Joan, where are we going to get that bad fire versus a good fire? And so I mean, AI has been a game changer in terms of giving us a way to look down at forests and parse those risks as well. So I think we're heading into a new era, and so I think folks should watch that space in terms of different private sector tools that are being developed and will be, in some cases, coming out over the next year or two that will complement some of these government tools and together I think can really give everyone a clear picture of where our risks are greatest.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Drew Gunn at Willis in Ohio. Maybe Michael, to you. Can satellite imagery be used to accurately identify wildfire exposure prior to a loss?
Yeah, I think I would call it aerial imagery, not satellite imagery, because satellite imagery can be helpful, but we at Travelers use aerial imagery, better resolution, and we can get very specific on the parcel, the structure, the surrounding area, the debris in the yard, the trees in the yard. And so yes, aerial imagery can be a very valuable tool. And in fact, as agents of Travelers, when you submit a policy, we give you access to the aerial images for that submission so that you and we can both look at them and help the customer assess their exposure.
Okay, great. Folks, the hour has flown by. I've learned so much. Please come back, Michael and Jad, and update us on the new technologies and the new initiatives coming in the next few years. So listen, thank you so much, Jad and Michael. I love this partnership. It's one of my favorite we have at Travelers, and we'll continue to do very good things together. So folks, anyway, thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
In the chat, we do have a survey. Please fill that out. Let us know what you thought of today's program and what other webinars you want to see. I want to share that we're going to be back in January, but we have a podcast. So in case you're looking for something while you're traveling, the Travelers Institute Risk and Resilience podcast, you can get on Apple or Spotify. So we're going to talk about January programming now. On January 15th, I'm going to welcome Moody's chief economist, Dr. Mark Zandi. He's a familiar face out there in the economics world. He'll share his forecast with us for the economy on January 15th. Then on the 22nd, we're going to sit down. We're going to slow it down a little bit. We're going to talk about meditation and yoga and best practices with Rebecca Pacheco. She joins us. She has coached Olympic athletes. She has coached C-suite executives about how to be more intentional about your well-being. Then on February 5th, I'm going to be joined by a geopolitical expert, Dr. Michael Mazar, for a look at the what's going on around the world and how it's going to affect your business. So tune in there. And last but not least, we have live in-person programming. So if you want to see us live, folks, check it out. We're going to be in Phoenix. We're going to be in Boise or Spokane in the first quarter. Come have lunch with us, and we're going to talk about lots of different things affecting your business. So my friends, have a wonderful and safe holiday season with your family and friends. And thank you so much for joining us on these programs. It really is energizing for us travelers to have such great engagement with our agent and broker partners and our employees. Thanks all. Happy holidays.